What's up guys? Today we're talking about one of my favorite plugins, which is the DS-10 Drum Shaper by XLN Audio. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of it already, but it's super versatile even though it's called Drum Shaper. Don't let that fool you. It's really useful in all kinds of scenarios in music production, so I want to take a look at some of the less obvious ideas about how you can make use of it in your own production. So let's jump in and take a look. So this here is what the DS-10 Drum Shaper looks like when you first open it. You can see at the top there's 3 tabs for 3 different modes for 3 different source materials, but you do not have to follow this religiously by any means. Essentially, it's just a little bit better geared for that type of material with this third kind of special knob. And this is one of the things that makes it unique from other transient designers, is that with a kick you get this tightness control, with a snare you get the body control, and the bus you get a presence control. But you can use any of these modes for anything just depending on what sounds the best. So the first scenario we're gonna look at is chopping up a drum break, if you're the type of producer who likes to do that. When you first add this, like let's say we were working with a drum break like this. You can hear all that stuff in the background, all the room sound and the beautiful imperfections of a live recording, especially an older one. But we can actually make it sound a little bit drier if we just pull the sustain down. So if we go like this. And then once you have the other instruments or maybe the wrapper on top of it and you like this kind of groove that the drummer is already playing, you can dry it up a little bit. It doesn't have to be so live sounding, which is kind of nice. But actually what I prefer to do is chop up each of these hits. So if you work in Ableton, you can just right click and press slice to new MIDI track and you'll get something that looks similar to this here. And you can play each individual slice. So you can get a little bit more creative with how you are processing each of those samples and in what order you're playing them in. But I like to add the drum shaper on top of the drum rack or whichever sampler you like to use, and then dry it up from the individual hits because you get even more control over how dry sounding you want it to be, or even how roomy if you want to go the other direction, okay? Then we start to bring the sustain down. So if you wanted the drums to have a little bit more attack, you can increase the dynamic range or even make it sound like there's some parallel compression applied, sort of that New York style, but to the extreme here. So check this out. If we raise the sustain up, it's going to increase the gain after the initial hit, right? So you can really get creative with whatever type of sound you're after here. This doesn't require much processing power on the part of your computer. So I think in this session right now, as it is, I think I have like 10 of these going and it's barely doing anything to the CPU usage. So it's kind of nice to not have to worry about that type of thing too much. As I mentioned earlier too, that this is called a drum shaper, but it does not need to be used just on drums only. In fact, I use it outside of drums most of the time, to be honest. Let's take a look at what it would sound like if we use it on like a plucky synth sound. The thing with the plucky sounds is that you have to be careful with how those plucks sit in the mix because they can be a little bit harsh sometimes. And a nice way to control that is actually with the DS-10. So I'm just going to keep it on bus mode and we're just going to reduce the attack a little bit until it's curbing that harshness a little bit. And we could even bring the sustain up a little bit too if we wanted to, so that it's emphasizing the next part of the sound rather than the transient. Another really cool thing to think about too is the relationship between the attack and what's called the mojo knob. And in this case, it's going to control the presence, or basically the brightness, the ultra brightness of the sound that we're working with. Now, I consider these two to have almost an inverse relationship to get the best results. So if you bring the attack down, it's kind of nice to bring the presence up because you don't want it to sound too dark because you're just getting rid of the transient, which is usually the brightest part of the sound, right? So if we brought the attack down, let's bring the presence up. And conversely, if we brought the attack up here, let me just reset the mojo here. If we brought the attack up and emphasize that part of the sound, we can bring the presence down a little bit. And those of you really listening to can hear that it changes the relationship between the initial sound, the source, and the reverb in the background, because I'm using it as a return right now. So if you increase the transients, you can actually get more of the initial sound sending to the reverb, and it kind of sparks more of the reverb in the background, which could be an interesting way to play around with your sound design. So if we increase the attack here, you can hear the reverb start going a little bit harder. Or the other way around, it softens the amount of the send to the reverb. Maybe another thing to think about too is adding the drum shaper before the reverb in the actual return track, and then increasing the attack from there to get a different response from your reverb without completely affecting the dry signal in any sense. That's kind of an interesting idea. I'm going to do that right now. I just thought of that. So let's go to our reverb track here, and I'm going to add this here and increase the attack and see what happens. So. That's actually an interesting way to extract more of the reverb out of a certain signal without necessarily just turning up the send. You see, we're discovering all kinds of new uses for this. Let's say we've got that dialed in how we want it now, but we're also going to add kind of a plucky bass sound to complement our plucky synth sound. So if we had something like this, we can apply sort of the same technique to our synth bass sound. So we could either accentuate the attack to complement the pluck that's already there, or we can dial it back in to soften everything to perhaps make more room for the vocals or the drums or whatever it is that you want. And I really like using this on plucky bass sounds. So let's actually on this one add a little bit more attack to the bass since we took it away from the pluck, and see how that sounds. And I'm actually going to turn on the soft clipping so that it adds a little bit of nice saturation to when we start getting into the nonlinear zone here by adding more attack. And don't forget to go the other direction too, to add more of the sustain as well. So maybe we could just dial back the attack a little bit and then accentuate the sustain a little bit so it kind of raises up in volume as, you know, the note goes by, and accentuate that low end part of the chord progression. I really like the creative zone that we're in, where we can kind of push things and pull things back in that short little window, which really makes a difference when you listen to everything together. So the last scenario I want to bring up here is that, have you ever felt like when you add a perk loop to whatever it is that you're working on, that it can sound a little bit harsh because of, you know, the high dynamic range of each perk sound? Like, for example, if you had this triangle loop, it's a little bit piercing and harsh, and you can of course turn it down, and you can also try doing something like low passing it, but I don't necessarily want it to be darker. I just want it to be a little bit more controlled. So let me show you what the DS-10 can do in a scenario like this. So we just start to bring the attack down, and I'll solo this so you can hear what it's doing. So now let's listen to it dry and then wet to see which one we like better. You can hear that it dials back that harshness a little bit, and that can be a really useful thing to use it on as well. But if you add this to something that has a lot more going on outside of the hits in the drum loop, so like for example this one, if we add the DS-10 with the same settings, would bring the sustain all the way up and the attack down, you can emphasize every other aspect of the loop besides the actual transient. So that could be kind of a cool way to add some more textural elements that are already inside of the loop that you're working on to give a little bit more dimension to whatever beat or song you're working on. Now, this isn't like an exhaustive list by any means. I mean, we even discovered like a couple of new ways that we could use the drum shaper in the middle of the video. So I encourage you guys to really get creative with the relationship between the attack and the sustain in all kinds of different stuff that you use in your production. And if you do discover anything unconventional or interesting, please do share with us down in the comments. I would love to hear how everybody uses transient designers in their own music. So as always, happy music making, and we'll see you guys very soon in the next video. Take care. Peace.